a sovereign government like the United States government, like the UK government, can afford anything that's available for sale in British pounds in the case of the UK, or in US dollars, because it has full financial sovereignty. It's very different than a company that doesn't have financial sovereignty. It can't print its own currency. It can't control its finances in the same way as the issuer of the national currency. So you and I, individuals, firms, households, we have to earn revenue first in order to be able to spend. But national governments don't operate under the same principle, sovereign governments, because they create money into existence.
This is the Pileus MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, my name's Christian Riley and welcome to episode 4 of the Modern Monetary Theory podcast. You just heard MMT economist Fadhel Kaboub talking about what all economists know and what maybe now you know from listening to our first 3 episodes, that here in the UK and many other countries in the world, taxes don't fund government spending, because our government is the issuer of our currency, be it dollars or pounds, and it can never run out of that currency, so it can afford to buy anything for sale in that currency without limit, including the time and labour of people who are looking for paid work and can't at the moment find it. I'm talking here about involuntarily unemployed people. The thing is, the way our currency system works, nobody has to be involuntarily unemployed. Keeping people involuntarily unemployed is a policy choice rather than something that just happens. In real terms, the wealth of a nation is all the goods and services, know-how, ideas, software, you name it, that the people of that nation can produce. To let involuntary unemployment happen is to let that wealth go to waste every day. Economists call the productive output lost due to unemployment an Oken gap. And just to put Oken gaps into perspective, economist Bill Mitchell worked out that in 2010, the gross domestic product of the United States lost due to involuntary unemployment was $10.3 billion every day. Involuntary unemployment has cost more than all the wars in history. So why don't our political systems deliver a solution to this waste and destruction? Well, it's because we, the people, haven't installed the politicians and demanded the policies to solve it. How do we solve it? Well, first, a warning. If you don't like clearly defined road-tested solutions to clearly defined urgent problems, you might be distressed by what you're about to hear. Fadhel Kaboub is about to describe in detail the silver bullet that kills involuntary unemployment and all its negative impacts dead in its tracks. That silver bullet is called the Job Guarantee Program, or the transition job. It's not a pipe dream, it's been tried and tested, and this week, as we record this, in the somewhat government-phobic United States of America, it has gained massive support and visibility from mainstream politicians who have been put under pressure by they the people. Me and Patricia were very lucky to catch up with Fadhel, who was so generous with his time on a recent visit from the US. I want to extend our huge thanks to him, and also an invitation to you, the listener, to get in touch with me, Patricia, or Fadhel himself with any questions you might have about the job guarantee or MMT in general. We deserve a better economy.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It was fun to meet some of the MMT and job guarantee community here in the UK. So a lot of people are talking about the job guarantee this week, actually, in the United States, because it's on the political agenda, at least for some of the Democrats. And there's a lot of confusion about what the job guarantee is. A lot of people here, especially in the business community, they think, oh, does that mean that we have to guarantee jobs to everybody that we hire and we can't fire anybody? So that's a misconception, obviously. The job guarantee is not about forcing private business to guarantee jobs for their employees. And it's also not about guaranteeing jobs in the sense that nobody will be fired or nobody's allowed to switch jobs. So the idea here is that capitalism as a system, by nature, is unable to produce enough jobs for everybody who's willing and ready and able to work. So it produces what we call involuntary unemployment. meaning you're ready, willing, and able to work, but you can't find work in the private sector, you can't find work in the government sector, you can't find work in the nonprofit sector. So you end up unemployed. And that kind of unemployment, involuntary unemployment, has a huge cost on society, financial cost, but also emotional cost to society. So lots of studies across the world showing that every time we have high levels of involuntary unemployment, we see increases in crime, increases in domestic violence and child abuse and poverty, malnutrition, depression, suicide. All of these things are very painful for individuals and their families and costly to society, because we're paying for the cost of building prisons and dealing with all the negative costs of policing and security and the cost of people getting sick, literally getting sick and going to a hospital. All of those things have a massive financial cost.
And one of the things about that is that in this country, at least, we have a very low headline unemployment rate. Mm-hmm. So what would be the use of a job guarantee if we're already technically in full employment, as many people say?
Right. If we're at full employment, then we shouldn't be worried about offering a job guarantee, because nobody will show up. But if we offer a job guarantee today and millions of people show up around this country, around the world, then we know that there's that what we call hidden unemployment that the official statistics don't really capture. And this is not to put the blame on the ONS and here in this country, or the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US, because they do provide us with those additional numbers that journalists don't report, that policymakers don't talk about. They do provide us with the numbers of people who are employed part-time, but are considered working because they're working part-time, they're getting paid. But most people working part-time would be willing, would be interested, would be looking for a full-time job if it's available. So that number, hides some of the level of unemployment. Then there's people who are discouraged because they looked and they looked and they looked very actively for a long time. They applied to every single company in the area. They've done job interviews. They've went to employment agencies, and there was nothing available to them for weeks and weeks and months. And then they gave up. People get discouraged and they're just waiting for a call back from those interviews. So those people are dropped from the official statistics, but the ONS will report on the number of those people. They will not add them as officially unemployed. So if you take those categories, and there are many other categories. In the US, there's issues with public transportation, for example. There's 2 to 3 million people who are dropped out of the unemployment statistics because these individuals are qualified, they apply for jobs, they even get jobs, but then they don't have access to public transportation to get to the workplace on time in the morning and be back, and they can't afford to buy their own transportation because they're underpaid, so they lose the job. So those people are also not included in official statistics.
Is the idea that I could just, go to a job center and say, I want a job, how quickly can you provide me with one? So
there has to be some discussion about the design and the logistics of this, which I'm happy to discuss, because right now we don't have a job guarantee in place. So it's all about how do we design it, and I'll be happy to outline what the literature has said about the design. But to answer your question directly, the job guarantee offers, the government offers an employment opportunity to anybody who's ready, willing, and able to work in their own community. So take people as they are, where they are, with the skills they have. And if there is need for job training, it will be on-the-job training, paid work. It can be full-time and it can be part-time, because some people do need to work only part-time for family reasons. If you have an elderly parent or a child you have to take care of, or any other community engagement or personal needs, the job guarantee will not force you to work full-time. The job guarantee will also not force you to work in a particular occupation. The job guarantee will not force you to work at all. If you opt not to work, for whatever reasons, personal reasons, ideological reasons, you don't want to work for the government, you don't want to work in a community development type of enterprise, you want to work for a private sector company, the job guarantee will not force you to work. Right? It's for people who are really looking for work and want to have a basic minimum level of sustenance to have to be able to develop even their professional skills. Because the thing that a lot of people don't realize about the involuntary unemployment category that a lot of people in the private sector, they call the unemployable. It's a sort of dirty, nasty code word for saying...
they call them scroungers over here. And
right.
It's a horrible word.
Because it's a reference to women, minorities, people with no education, people with very little experience, people with disabilities, people who spend time in prison and come back and trying to put their life together and nobody would hire them. So all of these, when we're talking about the job guarantee, it hires off the bottom of the labor market, those who the private sector will not employ for whatever reason. So they tend to be first to be fired when the economy hits a recession, and they tend to be last to be hired when the economy is booming. Right. So the job guarantee is primarily going to benefit that category. And over time, society as a whole will benefit because we're lifting up the level of skills and experiences. And we're not competing with the private sector because the job guarantee program, and ideally, if you ask me to design it, I would have 2 tiers of a job guarantee. One is take the existing social services that we already have, and we know for a fact that those organizations are understaffed. And people who engage with those organizations, they know that they're not being provided the services in the level of quality that we would expect. So if you're talking about schools, having assistant teachers, having after-school programs with people teaching music lessons and sports and all kinds of things, these programs are being cut from schools across the world because we say we can't afford it. Right? So for people who say there's really no employment to be done, that's not true. So the first tier of the job guarantees expand the existing organizations and fully fund them. Properly staff them. The second tier is kind of the large-scale national infrastructure, which is, building roads and highways and airports and ideally building green infrastructure today. This is an opportunity to build green infrastructure. And that's kind of not tailor-made community by community. It's nationwide. We know that most countries need a revamp of their infrastructure, green infrastructure in particular. And then once you're done with the staffing basic services and doing the national large-scale infrastructure, you'll still find pockets in certain communities, in certain cities and towns that have very different unemployment structures. Urban areas, rural areas, deindustrialized areas, and that's where you have to rely on local, decentralized decision-making to essentially make a list. You're making 2 lists. The first list is a list of the local needs. If we need, particular after-school programs in particular communities, maybe the urgent need is dealing with the drug addiction or dealing with child abuse or dealing with whatever the local, or dealing with high rates of cancer because of pollution, because there's a need for environmental cleanup in the river or in the water system. So different communities will have different needs. So the first list is what are the priorities that the community itself identifies, that nobody in the national government will necessarily be able to identify. So it has to be local. The second list that the community does, community leaders, and it can be, municipalities, or it can be government agencies. Councils, but it can be NGOs and community activists who are already trying to deal with this, but they don't have the resources and staff. The second list is the list of the local unemployed population and the skill levels that they have. And if the skills match the need of the community, then we start organizing using human ingenuity and putting the resources together to address those needs. And if the skills lack, then that's where the on-the-job training happens. So dealing with those particular priorities will be a little bit slower, but it will be dealt with, and the skills will be developed, and most of the skills will be transferable. This is the part that most people don't recognize, that professional skills are transferable from one profession to the other, from nonprofit sector to for-profit sector. And that's what gives us the flexibility of the job guarantee that guarantees permanent full employment for everyone. But then as the economy in the private sector starts to boom, and it will boom because now you have a large segment of what used to be involuntary unemployment have decent jobs with decent wages and benefits, have income security, so they can afford to take the risk, quote unquote risk of, buying a new car, or they can afford to take quote unquote risk of buying an apartment or take the risk of investing a little bit more in education and skills. And so that will increase economic activity in the private sector. So now the question, when the private sector starts to boom, where will it find workers to hire from? And that's where transferable skills come in. So you can hire people from the pool of the job guarantee workers, but in order to hire them, you have to offer them at least the same wage and benefits package and workplace condition and dignity in the workplace. And if you can't, well, you have to bid it up a little bit, right? If you're really looking for, employees to contribute to your business, right? Because the only reason you're hiring is because you expect additional revenues from the economic activity that you're seeing coming through the door. And if you're not willing to pay for it, then I'm sorry, your business model is not working. It's not going to work. Right?
When it comes to providing dignity, I know you said the wages on the job guarantee would have to be like some sort of, you use the word basic, but in the US, the level at least has been set at $15 an hour, which as far as I know is considerably higher than the proposed minimum wage,
right.
or
the existing minimum wage.
Than the existing minimum wage. So how generous can the job guarantee be in terms of wages offered?
Right. So the existing minimum wage is about half the $15 an hour that Bernie Sanders and others are talking about. But the actual living wage, in the U.S. there's a national database created by an MIT geographer, not an economist. It's available if you Google the MIT living wage calculator in the U.S. It will give you the living wage and the cost of living in every county in the United States. And it's broken down by how much it costs for, a family of one, a family of two, a family of four with, 2 children, one working, one not working. So very detailed database. And that $15 an hour is not even, doesn't cover it, actually. Okay. In most places, especially for families with children. Right? It will have to be $20 an hour. So the problem that we have in the U.S. is not only the minimum wage is not a living wage, but also we lack all the additional benefits, health benefits and childcare benefits. And so it's in the U.S. it's much more challenging to push this on the political agenda than say in the U.K., where you already have, reasonably well-established amount of social services and support for families, which is under attack because, right now, but you're much closer to sustaining that and pushing forward. But in terms of your direct question about affordability, a sovereign government like the United States government, like the UK government, can afford anything that's available for sale in British pounds in the case of the UK or US dollars because it has full financial sovereignty. It's very different than a company that doesn't have financial sovereignty. It can't print its own currency. It can't control its finances in the same way as the issuer of the national currency. So you and I, individuals, firms, households, we have to earn revenue first in order to be able to spend. And if we have to spend beyond our actual income, then we have to borrow. And there's a limit for borrowing. It depends on how much your bank is willing to lend you. But national governments don't operate under the same principle, sovereign governments, because they create money into existence and they collect taxes later. Most people think that national governments collect taxes first in order to spend, but it's completely illogical because if you have to go back to the beginning of the beginning when the currency was created at first, it's always created by a sovereign government, spent into existence, and then taxed later.
That is a very important point that we should just take a pause and say that's exactly how it happens. So that's why our government can't run out of pounds. And that's why a job guarantee program, it's not a letter to Santa Claus. It is something that can happen, as long as the political will's there. And that's really what conversations like this are about, just trying to illustrate that.
Right. So people need to look into this concept and this description of how any financially sovereign government actually operates, and it's known as MMT or modern monetary theory. So a lot of people can look it up. But I want to explain.
Well, this podcast is dedicated.
Yeah, this podcast is the MMT podcast. But because podcast conversation to be short, and we can go on for a long time. I want to illustrate with just one brief example, because a lot of people say, "Oh no, this doesn't make any sense. The government must be like everybody else, like a household. It needs to then." Because a lot of people say, "Why does the government borrow money then?" Right? Because governments sell bonds or gilts in this country. And then it must be borrowing money in order to spend. And politicians tell us all the time, we're borrowing to fund the war. We're borrowing to fund healthcare. We're borrowing to do this and that, right? Well, let me give you just one example to kind of spark your imagination a little bit about this concept. So think of World War II in the United States. Chronologically, it happened right after the Great Depression, the worst time in U.S. Economic history. The country was broke. Millions of people were poor and starving. Even with the New Deal spending and all of that, and the government thought it was broke. People were broke, so there was no money. Or at least people thought that there was no money. And then the war happened, and the U.S. enters the war, and all of a sudden, the government went with full-fledged, full employment, massive investment in building up the war machine. And where did the money come from, right? There was no tax before the war to fund it. There was no borrowing. Even the borrowing didn't happen before the war. Yeah. The borrowing happened during the war, after all the money, quite a bit of the money was spent into existence to start the war. Then the quote-unquote borrowing started to happen, which is the U.S. Treasury started selling Treasury bonds, and they marketed them specifically as freedom bonds to call on all the patriots who have a lot of cash, because now they're working and they're paid reasonably well. And normally people would use their money to spend it to buy houses and cars and everything else. But there were no new houses being built because nobody was building them. There were no new cars being produced, literally, because the entire city of Detroit was turned into a military production machine. Right? All the private companies stopped producing cars. You will not find new car models during those years. So all that money in the hands of the workers, in the hands of people, the government wouldn't be able to let it go into spending, because it will be bidding up prices and causing inflation. So that's when the freedom bonds came in. Freedom bonds was to convince the good patriots to postpone their spending until after the war. So it's a less coercive way. Because one way you can do it, you can tax the population and take the money away. But selling bonds, freedom bonds in that case, was a friendly, less coercive way of postponing your consumption, and the government will give it back plus interest in the future. And that's exactly what happened after the war. People got paid back, because when the federal government promises to pay you back, they never default, unless they want to do it for political reasons, but there's no financial reasons for default. And that's when all the post-war boom happened, with all the construction and economic growth. And so the point here is that there was no taxes to fund World War II, and that's a massive war. That's a massively expensive war. And there was no borrowing that happened to fund the war.
There was nothing to tax, right? People had no money.
There was nothing to tax, right? There was nothing, and there was nothing to borrow from, right? So money was created into existence. What we call borrowing and taxing always comes later. Now, this, again, to make a clear distinction, that this is for sovereign governments that can print their own money, create money into existence. You and I work in the exact opposite way, which is why it's always confusing for individuals to say, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not how I earn and spend my money. That's now how I borrow. So always distinguish between sovereign governments like the UK government, like the American government, the Japanese government, Canada, Australia, those governments, versus you and I, individuals, households, firms, nonprofit organizations. We're all users of the currency. So we operate with a completely different financial model.
Great. Okay. So we've put that to bed. It is affordable.
I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. So some people listening to this might think, job guarantee, that sounds a lot like government intervention. I don't like government. It starts that neural circuitry working of like, big government.
Slippery slope to communism.
Yeah, all that stuff. And Warren Mosler says these days, I think, I don't talk about the job guarantee. I talk about the transition job.
Right.
It's the same thing.
Right.
He prefers to call it that now after he invented MMT. He prefers to call it that.
Right.
I mean, I know none of us are in his head, but I think I understand why he likes to say it like that. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of, if you read the literature on what we call the job guarantee, there's a lot of names that have been used in the past. So one of the older names is the employer of last resort. And that also has sort of a negative connotation that it's, the last resort. The job guarantee, bothers a lot of people in the business world. Like you hear these people say, well, how can you guarantee jobs? This will be like communism or something like that. So, communicating the message, in the way that I describe it today takes, a few minutes, but the label that we use, so some people use the label public service employment, right? Which is also
depends on the audience, right?
Right, depends on the audience. But Warren likes the transitions job because it's a transition to the private sector ultimately, right? When the private sector starts to boom, would you rather, as a private sector employer, would you rather hire somebody who's been unemployed for 2 years and their skills have depreciated, they didn't really develop new skills, they're coded unemployable, or hire somebody who's working in a community development, job guarantee program or transition job program because they have professional skills, they have a track record, they've been showing up on time, they can get a reference letter from their employer, you can verify their record. Which one would you rather hire? Somebody who's more employable or somebody who's quote unquote unemployable? It's a no-brainer. So it's easier. It's like you're providing a ready-to-go labor force for the private sector. You're actually subsidizing that labor force, but instead of subsidizing it in the old-fashioned way where, you ask the company to hire somebody and you pay their wage and that creates all kinds of problems, you're doing the training and maintenance of professional skills in an external program that also happens to be beneficial to society, right? So it's not a quote unquote waste of resources.
At the moment, we have an unemployed buffer stock,
right? So exactly, you mentioned the term buffer stock. So buffer stock, we have for people who are not familiar with the term. The job guarantee is a buffer stock for labor, and we have all kinds of examples of buffer stocks in the economy that are used by governments because they're extremely important in stabilizing prices for commodities, key commodities that we believe are important for stabilizing prices. We use it also in financial markets. Central banks operate, permanent buffer stocks essentially, where if the market is going into, a speculative bubble, central banks will intervene to tame the bubble, to, tame it a little bit.
So what is a buffer stock for the audience that probably hasn't even heard that word before?
Right. So a buffer stock is typically used for food commodities, for, corn and wheat and beef. So corn and wheat and other coffee, for example. So for example, if you're a farmer, if you have a country that's highly productive in producing corn, like the United States, if farmers flood the market with corn production way beyond what the market needs, the price will go to zero. Right, that's what the free market does. If it goes to zero, it destroys. Right, it destroys the industry. Farmers will go bankrupt. So instead of that, the government will intervene and buy the excess surplus of corn, store it away. For bad seasons in the future, and the government will buy enough of the corn until supply and demand of corn stabilize at a price reasonably profitable for farmers. Right? And then 2-3 years down the road, if there's a fire, if there's a storm, if there's a crop failure, and at that point there wouldn't be enough production, so the price of corn would have gone up tremendously and consumers will face food price inflation, that's when the government steps in and releases some of that corn that was stored away to meet the demand of the market, so that the price of corn is not too expensive for consumers, but also not too low for producers. And it operates as a permanent buffer to stabilize the price of that basic commodity.
So that protects the farmers and the consumers.
And consumers, exactly. In bad years. And it's done in a variety of markets. But so we have we have buffer stocks, these things that operate like buffers, in fact, to prevent. Yeah.
Bill Mitchell came up with the idea of he was in a class and they were talking about wool.
Yeah, exactly.
Like in Australia, they have wool, and they have a buffer stock in wool, and it means that 100% of wool there's no unemployment. It's 100% of wool is being employed. And it's like, why can't we apply this to people?
Exactly. That's how Bill Mitchell got the intuition, because when you think about it, corn and wool and all of these commodities that we have buffer stocks for, we don't allow their price to go to zero. But the price that we pay for labor, right? Most people think it's the minimum wage. Well, the minimum wage is the wage for the employed, but the unemployed, their minimum wage is zero. So we allow the price of labor to go to zero, but not the price of corn. For countries that don't have, social benefits and employment benefits, it's zero, right? And it's not. So that's why the buffer stock for labor, the job guarantee program or transitions job program, operates as a buffer for this. But instead of, storing people away like you do for corn, you want to use, the surplus labor, resources in a useful, productive way, in a dignified way, in a way that prepares people to move up the economic ladder with their skills, with their experiences, with their engagement with the rest of society.
Scott Fullwiler, who's an economist, an MMT economist, he made a very interesting point that our macroeconomic policy, and both in the US and the UK, actively seeks for a proportion of the population to stay unemployed.
Right.
And yet we still have these attitudes towards the unemployed.
So blaming them. So
as if it was their fault.
Hang on, it's built into your economic plan that some people need to be unemployed.
Can you explain a little bit why this kind of Western societies actively look for a pool of unemployed people?
Well, so there's the theoretical, explanations that economists come up with, which we can debunk if you're interested in. But there's the more popular sort of intuitive notion that everybody has been brainwashed into believing in, that there's this natural rate of unemployment. That if we make efforts to try to reduce unemployment below a certain point, and we're actually at that point. Some economists will say we're at the natural rate of unemployment. They don't usually say it like that, but they say we're at full employment, which means we're at the natural rate of unemployment that they believe. And you ask, what is the natural rate of unemployment? They say, well, sometimes it's 5%, sometimes 4%, sometimes it's 3%. The lower you go, they'd say, well, now this is the one. This is the natural one.
We really mean it this time.
This one.
Don't create any more jobs. It's going to be terrible.
And here's how they explain it. They say, well, as you, let's say you start from a higher level of unemployment, and the unemployment starts going down and going down and going down. Usually there's no inflation. And then at some point, inflation starts to tick up a little bit, say, aha, this is the natural rate of unemployment. That's if we start pushing beyond that, and inflation will start to accelerate, right? And these economists have this inflation phobia, and yet they have no serious theory of inflation that makes sense. And I think this is why MMT probably has the best theory of understanding how inflation kicks in, how hyperinflations happen. And it's the only approach that gives you a realistic perspective on how far the potential of government spending is and how to deal with inflation. So when you look at what are the things that are causing inflation, and it's specific to different countries. So sometimes it's energy imports. Sometimes it's food imports for countries that have food that rely on international markets. This country is
highly dependent on food imports.
Right. Sometimes it's the cost of healthcare. So you realize, well, solving the healthcare crisis, the shortage of resources in the healthcare industry, has nothing to do with the central bank setting the interest rate. You have to deal with the actual problem. So that's why I say I work a lot in developing countries, and I say the inflation problem is not something that the central bank is going to fix. It's the Ministry of Agriculture, it's the Ministry of Trade, it's the Ministry of Health. Those are the institutions that will actually solve the real resource problem, because prices start to tick up when you have lots of demand for a particular thing and not enough supply. And the only way to end that is by producing the productive resources that particular area needs. So if you have shortage of food prices are going to go up. How are you going to end it? Not with interest rates, not with exchange rates, not with austerity, by producing more food.
So these economists seem to operate under the idea that there's not enough food for everybody. from the start. So at some percentage, 95%, 96%, they'll stop there because, we can't feed the rest because otherwise inflation will kick up and everybody will fight over for food. That's kind of how I understand the mentality.
Yeah, it sounds like a caricature, but it's actually true. A lot of people believe this, and then they fall into this Malthusian trap of, global population is too high and we can't afford it, when there's a global surplus of food everywhere, right? It's just there's a question of distribution of those resources.
And that's the thing. I see a society in America, for example, that the food consumed per person is considerably higher than anywhere else in the world. Yep. And yet, if you go to America, you still see people who can't afford to eat.
Right. Absolutely. So it's always a question of distribution. Yeah.
So just to bring it back to unemployment, the economy as a whole isn't spending enough to take people out of unemployment. The government can create pounds out of thin air to put more pounds into the economy to employ these people that taxation is unemploying. The reason that we favour a job guarantee above all other things to plug that demand gap is what?
So I wouldn't say it's necessarily an MMT story, but it's a classic sort of Keynesian story, the demand-led economic growth. So if you start with the private sector and you focus on a particular company, you say, well, why are they employing only 100 people? Why aren't they employing 150? Because that's what they need as a business, because there isn't enough demand for their output to warrant hiring another 50 people. So then the question is, why is there not enough demand for that particular industry? Well, because that's the total demand that we have based on the income that consumers have. So if you increase income for consumers through, for example, taking 5% of the population that happens to be unemployed and you give them, a job guarantee or transition job guarantee, then they have the income potential to spend more on entertainment and transportation and buying clothing and whatever else the private sector is selling. So now as a business, if you see more customers coming through the door, buying goods and services, that's the signal that you're waiting for to hire an additional set of employees to help you out at the shop, right? To meet the new demand. It's not the other way around. You don't produce stuff and store it in warehouses and hope for the best.
Yes.
Right? Nobody does that.
So somebody could be listening to this and argue, so why don't we just cut taxes to increase the aggregate demand and let the private sector employ that 5% of people? Personally, I think the job guarantee is superior to that, and maybe we need a bit of both. Why is the job guarantee superior to, say, universal basic income?
So I'll start with the tax cut thing, and then I'll go to the UBI. So cutting taxes, it depends on where you're cutting the tax. You can cut the tax at the top, the super rich, or the middle class, or lower income groups. It depends. The most effective tax cut will be a tax cut to the lowest income earners, because they're the ones who spend all of their income. So you give them a tax refund of $100 a month, they'll spend it.
Or lower VAT. In this country.
Lower value-added tax or anything. But if you give a tax cut to the super rich and they, receive an extra, 5,000, 50,000 or 50 million pounds or whatever, they may not even notice, right? Because they're not going to go on an additional shopping spree because they have a little bit of a tax cut.
It's just inflating their savings.
In fact, they might even take that money and put it into investing in property and push prices up.
Push up property prices for the middle class.
Yachts, maybe.
So, but there are,
and they have yachts.
Yeah, but there are tax cuts on particular things for corporations. If the tax cut is invested in research and development, it's very different than if the tax cut, that they receive is invested in speculative real estate or speculative financial markets. Those are qualitatively different kinds of tax cuts. Right? And there's a limit to how much the private corporate sector will invest even in research and development. It's not going to be the thing that will jumpstart an entire economy. Right? As a matter of fact, most research and development in the private sector, including the stuff that venture capitalists invest in, tends to be kind of the low-hanging fruits, the less risk, the least amount of risk in terms of how quickly can I get my return on this investment. The really heavy-duty, risky investment in research and development that tends to be long-term and expensive and kind of is what's done in universities, which is typically funded by government grants. Because you start and you fail and you experiment and you repeat, and sometimes by accident you discover something. That's really if you want long-term research and development.
So that's how we have the internet.
Right.
So what would you say, for example, there's a lot of people out there who favor UBI and they have heard of the job guarantee, and they say, well, why do you have to have this coercive system? You're forcing people to work for money. Why can't you just give the money to people and let them decide how to best spend their time?
So there's lots of problems with the UBI concept. I mean, philosophically, most UBI supporters come from, from the right place, right? They care for people, they care for dignity, they care about all of this. But from an economic standpoint, it's really not what we need and not what we can afford, in terms of real effects. So, for example, I always talk about the climate crisis that we're facing right now. We have, the climate is on fire, the planet is on fire. We have millions of people around the world who are involuntarily unemployed. And how will a UBI help us, clean up the mess?
Or right. Organize resources. We have all kinds of green technology at our fingertips, high tech and low tech solutions at our fingertips. Millions of people unemployed. Lots of things that need to be done to clean up the planet. And instead, we give everybody an income to do nothing about it. It's just not an efficient allocation of resources. So when you say afford, said it's not something that we can afford, I think
not monetarily. Yeah. I mean, in terms of our things that we need to do. Our life.
Yeah, the actual things that we need.
Humanity can't afford that from a real resource standpoint.
Things that can actually run out rather than pounds or dollars.
Right. And when we're gone, the planet will not miss us. Right. So the other issue with UBI is that you're guaranteeing income for everyone, the rich, the middle class, the poor, and the idea is that you're emancipating people from having to work for somebody else, so they can work for themselves, or they can, enjoy, literature or music, or they can, some people say they can, put their resources together as a small collective group of entrepreneurs and start a business, and it'll be kind of, worker-owned type of enterprise. So it doesn't have to be just always individual self-employed. But from an organizational standpoint, from a macro production standpoint, it's not going to be a functioning system, right? Plus, there's value in work for human beings. There's dignity in work, and it's not going to allow us to face the inflationary problems that will come from a UBI. Remember what I talked about a minute ago about inflation? When you have lots of demand for goods and services and not enough supply, it's very likely that under a UBI system, we'll have the income to raise the level of demand, but will not have the productive capacity to face that additional demand.
So we're giving pounds for consumption, but it's not for production. It's not going to go into any kind of goods or services. Right. So
I think some people might be productive.
Sure.
Some people would say that they'll be productive. I'm sure they would be. But
I didn't mean it in they'll just be spending and not working or not doing anything.
But the link would not exist. Sure. There wouldn't be a direct link between demand and production.
And another way I've often thought about it is UBI is. The job guarantee is like UBI, but you come to some agreement with the community about what you're going to do for that income.
And again, the job guarantee is not coercive, right? It's a guaranteed opportunity. Nobody's forced into the opportunity. And job guarantee, by the way, is not doesn't exclude people who can't work for physical reasons, health reasons, family reasons. The job guarantee program that all of us talk about includes a basic income for those who can't work or shouldn't work for health reasons or physical reasons. So the problem is having a universal basic income without an employment option. What we're proposing is an employment option first, which most people want, with a basic income for people who can't work.
It seems to me some people who advocate UBI think that, well, if I have this income, I'll become really entrepreneurial. I'll use it to do something good, but it will be voluntary and not coercive. And I think to myself, the conditions for you to be entrepreneurial exist now. Mm-hmm. You know, if you don't have a business plan that you can present to somebody and raise capital to get started up now under these conditions, I can't see what's giving you a guaranteed income is going to make you any more entrepreneurial.
And having a basic income to start your entrepreneurial venture, you could lose all of that basic income in that venture. And then what? Because a lot of people who are proposing this universal basic income, they're also proposing to remove all the other social subsidies and safety nets. So what happens when you gamble your basic income away in a particular business venture that doesn't materialize? If you have universal basic income, a lot of people, everybody will have that additional income to spend. Naturally, they're going to spend it on goods and services. Right? So if the demand for goods and services goes up, but the production of those goods and services is not increasing, it might be actually decreasing because a lot of people will quit their private sector jobs because now they have a basic income to guarantee a comfortable life, then production will either stay the same or drop, but demand will definitely increase, and that will start inflation. And there's nothing that can stop that inflation spiral other than increasing production, right? So the job guarantee provides a price stability feature, whereas the UBI, by design, has this potential for accelerating inflation. What we know from, for example, the employment program that was introduced in Argentina after the crisis in the 2000s. It wasn't a full-fledged job guarantee program, but it was employment, during a crisis for community development work. And it was most of the beneficiaries were in categories of people who were excluded socioeconomically from the economy for a long time. About 2 million people participated in that program overall. When people were asked, what do you like about this program? And they were asked to rank, their answers. It wasn't because of the income. Income was, because I earn a wage was at the bottom of the list. It was because I'm learning new skills, because I'm helping my community, because I feel engaged in society, because all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the monetary compensation.
I was wondering if we could just get into some FAQs about the job guarantee. People worry that, so you're telling people they can never be fired. That's a bad incentive structure to set up, that they're always going to be employed. Isn't that going to incentivize bad behavior? Right.
Well, if you read the job guarantee literature, not the Twitter feed from the critics, you will know that nobody in the job guarantee literature ever said that nobody in the job guarantee will be immune from people will not be immune from being fired. So you have to show up on time. You have to do your work. You have to, there's transparency, there's auditing, there's reporting, there's everything that you see happening in the private sector, in the traditional government sector, in the nonprofit sector. There's reporting and productivity. You have to show up on time. You have to do everything. The same thing will apply in the job guarantee system. There will be people who are part of the involuntary unemployed category who happen to have a drug addiction or alcohol addiction or suffer from mental illness. This is the thing that most people don't realize, that people are being stuffed in prison because they have a mental illness condition. That's a public health crisis. Right? That's not a criminal justice issue. Same thing with the job guarantee. There will be individuals who are ready to go, plugged in, show up on time and productive and everything. But there will be some individuals who have health conditions. And that's where, a society that cares and has an effective safety net will identify those individuals through counseling services, part of the job guarantee program, channeling individuals to the resources that they actually need. Because nobody wants to die of a drug addiction. Nobody wants to die from opioid addiction. But people are trapped into those addictions because of particular social issues and economic issues. And that's where the job guarantee will heal some of that, some of those issues, and reintroduce people in society. And over time, we'll have to deal with less and less addiction, less and less of those issues, because we've expanded the amount of services and the amount of care for people from a younger age, right? Because a lot of these addictions don't start, later in life. It starts when people drop out of school and they get into, because there is no after-school programs and there's no, community care or social network that brings people into productive activities or into finding their passion in life, because not everybody's passion in life is going through university or going through a particular thing. It's exploring all of these options at a younger age is what gives people the most of their potential.
Another thing that's worth hammering home is a thing that I think that stops it from being a big centralized government thing that could spiral out of control is it's federally funded, it's central government funded, but locally administered.
Exactly.
That's worth ramming that home. Yeah. So the kind of jobs that get created will be decided upon on the ground in the communities where they're needed. Other people might bring up this thing where, the thing that's making people unemployed is robots and automation and software, and you can't stop that. And what is the point of a job guarantee when it's actually, right. This is where the UBI people are coming from.
Sure.
Just give me an income because there's nothing to do.
Right.
And now I don't believe that.
I understand.
But what's the easiest way to address that fallacy?
Well, there's starting from the beginning of the beginning, so to speak, and it should be very clear in this country with the Industrial Revolution, there was a Luddite movement, when the machines were brought in, and people used to break into factories in the middle of the night and destroy these evil machines that are taking their livelihood, right? And, we're way past, so industrialization
the equivalent of that now would be breaking into Microsoft and just deleting
deleting the codes,
everything that makes a spreadsheet, right? Smash all that up so that nobody's ever allowed to make a spreadsheet again, and we go back to using abacuses and full employment happens.
Right. I mean, so the process of automation and industrialization is a continuous process. We've never stopped having machines and new technological innovations displace old technologies and old jobs and old industries, but at the same time we're creative and innovative and we create new things, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, we're not even close to the robots taking over.
That's the thing. I can't wait for it to happen.
That's not my expertise, but you ask people who are working in this domain and they tell you this is still science fiction, the idea that driving cars and robots taking over the whole thing. So,
and to some extent, I mean, how desirable is it? I understand a lot of the more menial jobs will be taken over by robots. And I think to some extent that's a good thing.
That's a very good thing.
If we could find robots we should do this podcast, that would be great.
No, that's
I could be making a cup of tea.
That's an extremely important thing. I mean, we should leverage technological innovations and automation and robots to do the most precarious, the most dangerous work, the less dignified work that no human being should be doing. Doing that as quickly as possible would be wonderful. And then move people into dignified work, into fulfilling work, meaningful work, and to work that engages people in activities of care, caring for people, caring for children, caring for the elderly, caring for the planet. I go back to my point earlier. People say, what are we going to do? There's plenty to be done now. We'll run out of unemployed people if we took the climate crisis seriously.
You could at least start a department of what are we going to do next.
I saw in your talk, actually, you had a fantastic 2 or 3 slides of just examples of jobs that we could have right now of things that needed doing.
And I will not claim that I have the full list, there are certain things that I will not even know where to begin, because that's where, decentralizing decision making, the best people to identify what needs to be done are people who live in their own community, and they know people working in nonprofits, they're already dealing with local problems. They can quickly give you a list. Right. Yeah. And I've done this myself. I asked people working in nonprofits to say, if you were giving, a major grant from the national government today, will you be able to, is there more stuff to be done? I say, of course there is. Will you be able to hire a few more people? I say, of course. Where do
one of these people.
Where's the application form? Where do I send my form? Yeah. Right, so this is one of the things we're interested in doing. Scott Fullwiler and myself and a few other people were talking about this. Is doing a survey with nonprofits across the country and asking them, within reason, what will be the things that you would like to expand? How many people would you be able to hire and train, right away if you're giving a grant from the national government, and build a database to show that there's plenty of stuff to be done. It's very specific to specific communities, and we're not throwing away money. These are legitimate nonprofits that have applied and have a track record of doing useful, productive work in society. They have received grants from local and national governments, private foundations, from the Gates Foundation and this foundation, that. So it's not like a bunch of random people on the street that say, "Well, what are we going to do? Let's figure out something to do." We do have the infrastructure of the logistics of the program in place, except we fund them in a very minuscule way. They tend to be understaffed and underfunded all the time. And all we have to do is just expand the funding and then have them do the good work that they're already doing and just do more of it.
How would a job guarantee program look like on the ground? Let's say you wake up in the morning and you're unemployed, but you've heard about this thing called the job guarantee program that they've just implemented. What do? What happens?
So depending on which country or which community, but typically you would go to, instead of going to the unemployment agency, you go to the employment agency. So remove as Pavlina Chernova says, remove the U and the N. And based on your background and experience, so remember we said we make a list of all the needs of the community and have a list of projects ready to go, and you have a list of local unemployed individuals with their skills and experiences and background, and you try to place people in the job that's more suitable for their experience. And if their experience happens to be, not suitable for that particular occupation, then there's an opportunity for on-the-job training or learning new skills. And this, we have to recognize.
You could potentially have, for example, artists painting murals on the street, or musicians teaching kids how to play the piano.
Plenty of opportunities for beautification to begin with. And it's not like, this is not an invention that we're theorizing about. This has been done in the past. I mean, during the New Deal program, there was artists and musicians and theater writers who people who did oral history interviews. People interviewed the elderly in the community to preserve cultural heritage. There are recipe books that were published during the Great Depression by authors who were unemployed and then became employed in the job and the New Deal program and collected all of those stories. And now tell me about their transferable skills after the Great Depression. What did they do? They became authors and journalists and publishers. Some of them went to university and became professors. That's what Warren Mosler means by transition jobs, because you're taking people as they are, where they are, with the experience they have, with the resources we have, and do something meaningful, productive for society. Productive not in the business sense, but productive in the sense that you're building for future.
This is not about profit. This is about value for the community. It's not about profit. It's about writing a meaningful oral history of your local community. I mean, that's a treasure for humanity that will be lost when the elders of the community pass away. When you lose the history of a particular community, you lose everything. Right? And it becomes just a piece of land with old buildings and that nobody cares for. And there's lots of potential in the tourism industry. Tourism is, a lot of it is about, visiting interesting places, learning what's so special about this building, what's so special about this street. And when you learn that's how you build museums. That's how you build historical, But these are things, I hear more and more examples where, you need people skills for these kind of jobs.
Yeah.
Where I'm hoping robots. I mean,
right.
How could robots ever match that to the actual interaction between two people that kind of makes the whole service or whatever service you're providing all the better?
For people who are interested in this kind of work, the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College, levy.org, is a good place to go for, the recent reports that have been circulated in the media. Pavlina Chernova's website has, frequently asked questions about the job guarantee. There's a large community of MMT, job guarantee scholars and activists that you can find on social media. The Modern Money Network is a good place to visit, and I'll plug my own
plug away
group. It's the Benzager Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, which includes a large family of job guarantee and MMT economists, including Scott Fulweiler, Matt Forstater, Pavlina and Rohan Gray and Raul Carrillo, and it's kind of a complementary network of organizations: the Modern Money Network, the Benzager Institute, the Levy Economics Institute,
and they're all over the world.
Yes, we're scattered all over the world. We
need one here, don't we?
More than one, ideally. That's the idea. We wanted to build a network of people because I personally believe that we're not going to win this in academic debates and academic journals. I actually give up on economists because they're way too dogmatic and brainwashed into this natural rate of unemployment and all this stuff. And look at the debate today. It's in the public domain. It's policymakers, it's journalists and activists who are discussing this. Where are the economists? They have nothing to say about this, right?
Yeah.
Which is good. Eventually they'll catch up. So I believe that we're going to win this debate in terms of policy implementation by engaging with activists, by engaging with the average person, by engaging in the media, by building a critical mass, because you have to create a movement, right? And we don't want to wait for a Great Depression where people are starving and dying to say, well, now let's build a movement. This is, do you want to build a movement in not in a crisis mode, but during reasonably good economic times? And the neoliberal movement of the Reagans and Thatchers of the 1980s didn't win the debate in academic journals. They won the debate because they had a narrative that made sense to the average person. The timing worked well because they were able to, hit a nerve with a particular narrative with people who were suffering economically, and they had a narrative that made sense to the average person. It wasn't theoretical; it was intuitive. They used, very important, keywords that made sense to people in the context of the Cold War and freedoms and all of that, and that's how they won. And today we're going to win. Eventually with the same strategy. We have to build a movement because I'm confident we've built the theory. We have the ideas from an economic standpoint, from a legal standpoint. We have a huge team of legal scholars who have contributed to this kind of work. So we have a solid policy to work with. We need a movement. We need policymakers to take leadership and to push this into the public domain.
In the spirit of trying to get people interested in MMT, the uninitiated, the person in the street, if somebody said, right, just give me the elevator pitch, 2 minutes, 30 seconds, how do you get people to understand the urgency of MMT or get them excited about it?
The elevator speech is really not to explain the full thing, but to get people hooked, at least to kind of make people realize that whatever they had in mind before about, money and spending and government, the role of government in the economy is backwards. The logic is backwards. So here's take this scenario, show somebody a dollar bill or any, in the UK, the British pound or whatever, and ask them, where does this come from? And they say, well, of course, from the government. It's counterfeit if anybody tries to do it. It's illegal. You go to prison. They say, okay, so in order for you to have this dollar bill in your pocket, to be able to spend it, to be able to give it away or lend it to your friend, it must have come from the government first, right? So then you say, well, then where did the government get this money from? And they usually say, well, it was taxed from somebody else. We say, wait, you just contradicted yourself. You said it comes from the government. We know for a fact it's issued by the government. So it couldn't have been taxed, into existence. It's spent into existence. So it has to come into circulation first for those of us who are not allowed to print it, for those of us on this side to be able to use it and borrow it and lend it to each other. Private businesses, individuals, anybody who's not the UK government, right? So then the creation of money comes by definition when the government spends it into existence, and then taxation removes it from the system. So if the government doesn't need to tax in order to spend, you ask your friend, you say, well, then why do you think the government sells bonds or gilts? You say, well, because they borrow, because that's the usual thing that most people think. Why does anybody need to borrow its own currency that it can just print into existence? Within 2 minutes, at least you get their brains working to question the logic that most people think about. So you want something that allows people to think that whatever they knew, whatever they've been told about public finances is at least in those 2 minutes is at least challenged, and that they need to, as an informed citizen, they need to learn a little bit more about this alternative explanation that we just discussed today. And then, send them to, the MMT literature and the podcast.
That was the Pileus MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. You can get in touch with us via Twitter. Patricia is at Patricia N. Pino, and I'm Christ Riley. You can also email me at christriley@outlook.com. I'm going to spell those for you. Patricia is at PatricianPino, and I'm at ChristReilly. We hope to hear from you, and we hope you can tune in next week. Thanks for listening.
I
mean, if we could find
that's
robots
something we should
do this podcast, that would be great.